Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get rolling now. Hello, my name is Sue Santa. I am the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Legal Affairs at the Council on Foundations. On behalf of the Council and our President and CEO, Vicki Spruill, I want to welcome you all here today for this conversation about the role of nonprofit media in a vibrant civil society. I also want to welcome our virtual audience. This event is being live webcast across the country. So welcome to all of you who are viewing us in front of your computer screens as you're eating lunch. This event will also be recorded and available for future viewing, and for those of us who are participating, we will be sending you an email with that information when the event has concluded. I am really delighted that we are hosting this event today in the wonderful Knight Media Center here at the Museum in Washington, D.C. It is particularly appropriate because the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation has been a very strong supporter of nonprofit media, so wonderful to be here at this center. So let's move into the content of this discussion. As most of you probably know, nonprofit media organizations are groups that have 501c3 tax-exempt status as public charities on the basis that they educate the public about important issues. Now, these organizations educate communities through in-depth public interest reporting, including investigative journalism, news reports, explanatory journalism, solutions journalism, and specialty journalism in order to elevate important social topics. They play a particularly important role in communities that may be underserved by traditional for-profit media. There is no doubt that these organizations are critical to a healthy civil society, as our panelists are going to discuss today. Yet we're also going to discuss some of the challenges they face. In 2011, the FCC issued a report concluding that nonprofit media needs to play an increasingly significant role to help meet the educational needs of our citizens. But at the same time, these organizations often struggle to become tax exempt. This FCC report recommended that a group of tax and journalism experts gather to study these issues more carefully and make recommendations for future action. So in response, in 2012, the Council on Foundations convened a group of leaders from the foundation and tax-exempt media sector to meet over the course of a year and engage on the challenges and opportunities presented by the nonprofit media. Now, the Council is grateful that it was able to do this work with the support of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, among others. This working group produced a report in 2013, which is entitled The IRS and Nonprofit Media Toward Creating a More Informed Public, which is available up front if you don't have a copy, and available online. Now, CELIA ROADY and Clark Bell, who you're going to hear from in just a few minutes, are going to talk a bit more about that report and then what is happening today. So fast forward to today. We are proud to unveil an update to that 2013 report and continue this conversation about both the challenges and opportunities that nonprofit media organizations face and the vital role that they play. If you did not pick up a copy of the report, it is up front and again available online, and we're thrilled that we have it here today. Now, before we launch into that first panel, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping issues. The Twitter hashtag for today's event is #NPmedia, which is on the tent cards in front of you, and those who are viewing us virtually will probably see that on your screen. Now, at the conclusion of the two panels we're going to have, the first, which is going to give us a bit of an update on information around nonprofit media, and the second is going to be practitioners from the field talking about nonprofit media, we will have an open Q&A session. For those of you who are here with us today, you can stand up and submit your questions at these microphones that are positioned around the room. Now, for those of you joining us virtually, and also for those of you who are in the room, you can also submit questions using that Twitter hashtag, again, #NPmedia. Now, finally, if those of you who are joining us virtually are having any challenges with your virtual connection, please don't hesitate to contact the Council at membership.org or at 703-879-0600 to get more help. So With that, let us dive into the content. I am thrilled to have with us today two really leading experts on this issue of nonprofit media. CELIA ROADY is a partner and head of the tax-exempt practice at Morgan & Lewis. She is widely recognized for her legal skills and has served on the IRS Advisory Committee on Tax-Exempt Government Entities from 2010 to 2013. She also chairs the Georgetown University Law Center's annual conference and frequently writes and speaks on nonprofit issues. And more extensive bios are, of course, available in your programs. Clark Bell is the McCormick Foundation's Journalism Program Director. He joined the foundation back in 2005 and oversees journalism grant-making initiatives and shapes the program's focus on critical issues facing the news media. He is also a veteran reporter, editor, publisher, and communications consultant, and has a long career in all those areas, and so brings that expertise to the foundation's work. So on this first panel, CELIA is going to give us an overview of this new report, which she and one of her colleagues authored, and then we will turn to Clark, who will give some perspectives, not only having been part of this initiative from the beginning, but where he sees things today. Following this panel, we will then bring on our second panel of practitioners. So without further ado, CELIA, I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much, Sue, and it's great to see all of you this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the IRS and nonprofit media and what the recent developments are that we found when we worked on our report. And I have to thank my colleague, Kim Eney, who's sitting, Kim, raise your hand, who is the co-author with me of this report and really an invaluable colleague on this whole project. So the IRS and nonprofit media, what's the problem? What was the problem that the FCC identified back in 2011, and what's happened since then? So the basic rules, the basic tax rules about 501c3 organizations have not changed in more than 50 years. But the nonprofit sector has changed a lot. And one of the problems that the Internal Revenue Service has is keeping up with these changes in the nonprofit sector. And how do you apply these old rules that were 50 years old or more to these new developments in the nonprofit sector, to the new things that are going on? It's really a challenge to do that, and I think that's exactly what happened with nonprofit media organizations. Back in the 1960s, the IRS first grappled with the issue of what does it take for a nonprofit media organization or a nonprofit publishing organization to be tax exempt under 501c3. Well, back in the 1960s, the IRS is very worried about competition in this very commercial sector of the publishing sector. They were very worried about tax-exempt organizations trying to encroach on the grounds of commercial publishers. And so one of the standards the IRS adopted was that when publications are disseminated, they have to be disseminated by nonprofits in a manner that's different from ordinary commercial publishing practices. Well, back in the 1960s, that was pretty easy to do. When I set up nonprofit publishing organizations, what I would typically do is to ensure that there were some subscriptions, a significant number of them that were distributed free of charge to libraries or to schools, or there are other ways that you could get the content out to the public free of charge. Well, nobody anticipated back in the 1960s that commercial publishers would be doing the same thing, would be getting their content out free of charge. And yet, with the advent of the internet and digital media, that's exactly what happened. So what that meant is that when the IRS looked at tax-exempt applications for tax exemption for nonprofit media organizations, they applied the law, the rules that governed it, and they were looking to see how it was that nonprofit media organizations were distributing their content in a manner different from ordinary commercial practices. And the IRS was having a challenge figuring out what all of these differences were. And so that was one of the reasons that the IRS really became paralyzed with respect to this issue and started centralizing applications for tax exemption for nonprofit media organizations and just holding them and thinking about what to do about them. And this process was really causing a lot of delays, and so this is part of what the Knight what the FCC report identified and then the council's report in 2013 identified that there was this 1960 ruling was a real stumbling block in the IRS's ability to process these exemption applications. And the report of the council in 2013 made some concrete suggestions about ways that IRS guidance should be modernized and how you should be able to look at evolving standards and develop new ways to look at the situation. And I think one thing that was a very positive development from the 2013 council report and from the work that led up to it and the attention to this issue that came about as a result is that the IRS logjam was broken. And since that period of time, there have probably been 24 or so nonprofit media organizations that have been successful in getting their applications through the IRS. And so that's been, I think, a very positive development. And one of the findings, as we looked at what's happened since the council report, is that we were able to see that, in fact, a number of nonprofit media organizations have been able to get their tax exemption from the IRS. And I think we took a look at what the profile of those organizations is. What are the kinds of organizations, the newer nonprofit media organizations that have gotten tax exemption? What did they look like, and what could we learn from the process that they went through at the IRS? Not surprisingly, one of the things that we learned is that these organizations were typically created for the purpose of filling gaps that were left from cutbacks in coverage by for-profit papers, by for-profit media organizations. There was a lot more focus on investigative reporting, a lot more focus on local news, a lot more focus on ethnic issues and coverage of ethnic groups and ethnic issues. And so I think from that respect, part of what had been identified as a need, that the FCC had identified a need for the nonprofit sector to pick up the slack in this area, seems from the small sample that we looked at, seems to be addressed. One of the things that we noticed, too, when we looked at these applications for tax exemption is that the business model for many of these nonprofit news organizations was a business model that was quite dependent on grants and contributions. So we saw that many, not all, but many of the organizations showed that the most significant source of financial support was going to be grants and contributions. Now, what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that actually we do not yet have a good, sustainable business model for nonprofit news organizations. I mean, it's wonderful. There are many foundations that have provided a lot of significant funding for nonprofit media organizations, but I don't think anybody in this room would think that that's necessarily going to be a long-term solution. And so I think more needs to be done within the nonprofit media sector in looking through what are the kind of business models that are going to work over the long term, that are going to be able to make these nonprofit media organizations more sustainable over the long term. An interesting issue that we found is that the IRS seemed to be quite concerned about whether nonprofit media organizations were going to be violating a prohibition on intervention in political campaigns. 501c3 organizations, as most of you probably know, are not allowed to support or oppose candidates for office. Of course, you can have a nonprofit media organization that can cover, political campaigns and cover events, but what you're not going to see, or I don't think you're going to be seeing anytime soon in a 501c3 publication, 501c3 media organization, is going to be an editorial page, the Sunday before the election that comes out and says you should vote for the following roster. That would clearly be a problem. I think that's going to be a bridge too far for the IRS. But the IRS is very concerned that organizations be aware of this issue. And so when you fill out your 1023 application for exemption, you're actually asked a question specifically: are you going to support or oppose candidates for office? Uniformly, across the board, these organizations correctly answered, no, we're not going to do that. But that often was not enough for the IRS. They got follow-up questions from the IRS saying, do you really understand what this means? Here's a ruling that tells you exactly what can be done and what can't be done. Please confirm back to us that you've read this ruling and that you understand how that's going to work. So I think that shows a little bit of suspicion on the part of the IRS that there may be nonprofit media organizations that may be looking at sort of tilting one way or the other on the political campaign spectrum. To a lesser extent, the same was true with respect to lobbying. 501c3s are allowed to engage in some lobbying, but there's some limits, and the IRS wanted to make sure that these nonprofit media organizations that were certainly covering current events and covering legislative events, would understand what the lobbying rules were and how they applied. So those are some of the things that we think were really interesting and significant points that came about that we learned from our review of these applications. So then we ask ourselves, so where do we stand now? Have all of the issues that were identified, by the FCC in 2011 and the issues that were identified by the Council in the 2013 report, have those issues been addressed? And I think the answer that we came up with is sort of. We know that the logjam has been broken, and we know the IRS is now recognizing 501c3 nonprofit media organizations. They're now granting tax exemption to nonprofit media organizations under 501c3. What the IRS has not done, however, is to update that old 1960s revenue ruling. And so we still have on the books a revenue ruling that has that provision in it that says that the dissemination is supposed to be different from ordinary commercial practices. That then, I think, leaves us in a bit of a quandary. What we have is organizations that have been able to successfully get tax exemption despite the existence of that ruling, but it's still on the books. How likely is that going to be? Is that really going to pose a problem? Well, we hope that it won't pose a problem, but there are a couple of recent trends that suggest that it might be a little bit more likely to pose a problem at some point in the future. The IRS has done some restructuring in terms of how the application for exemption process is handled. In the past, the IRS centralized difficult cases, issues or cases that seemed challenging or difficult within the IRS headquarters office in Washington, D.C. They collected all of those and they handled them together as a group. And there were pros and cons to that. A con to that, obviously, is that until the IRS made a decision about what to do, everybody was stuck, in a holding pattern. The pro from that, though, is that everybody was going to be treated consistently. You weren't going to have one paper that got through from one agent in this part of the country and another one that was very similar that got hung up somewhere else. And so the IRS has now stopped that process of centralizing applications in the headquarters office. And so applications are simply assigned to whoever is first available, wherever they may be located, and without regard to their particular subject matter expertise in a particular area. So I think that leaves us with a situation where new nonprofit media organizations that are applying for tax exemption have somewhat more of a chance of getting assigned sort of randomly to different people on a first available, space available basis, if you will, and being treated inconsistently. And I think we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. And I think that's more of a likelihood since we have this old ruling still on the books, because somebody who gets a case and who's not familiar with the background of these issues, having not worked on it before, may go out and start doing some research and find that there's an old ruling out there that says these are the standards that should apply, and organizations might find themselves having to fight that battle again. So there's a solution to this, and the solution to this is quite simple and has been suggested by the Council on Foundations to the IRS and suggested, by others as well, and that is that the IRS should really take the time now that it's thought through these issues and update that 1960 revenue ruling. So we have some new guidance out there so that IRS specialists working these cases would know what the rules are. New nonprofit media organizations that want to apply for tax exemption know what the rules are. That would be the solution, and then we could update this old ruling and the problem we would hope would be solved. But as a practical matter, I frankly don't see that happening anytime soon. The IRS has got a lot of big projects on their plate. Many of you may know about the issue that the IRS has gotten a little bit of publicity about, the 501c4 issue. And what do you do about 501c4 organizations that are going to be engaged in political campaign activities? That's been a huge project, and it's still looming ahead and hasn't been resolved yet. So I frankly don't see the IRS turning attention to this issue anytime soon. So I think that leaves us with a sort of an untidy and imperfect reality. The log jam has been broken. Everything is working fine now. I'm not aware of any nonprofit media organizations that are still stuck trying to get their exemption from the IRS. And we just have to hope that that continues to be the case. And if it's not, I'll see where Susanna is sitting. There she is. I'm sure the council will be out here watching and waiting along with all of you and prepared to try to think through what do we need to do to tackle the problem if the issue comes up again. So that's a little background about where we are with the IRS and nonprofit media organizations. So Clark, what do you think about all that?
Well, thank you, Celia. You know, I believe in a not-for-profit business model for news, and that's one reason I was so honored to serve as a member of the original Council on Foundations work group on this project. The Robert R. McCormick Foundation's grant-making support for local news organizations actually goes back to the late 1990s, with support to such groups as the Chicago Reporter, which covers issues of race and poverty, and the Better Government Association, a powerhouse investigative watchdog that covers the shiftlessness and scandals that seem to permeate Illinois politics. The growing importance of nonprofit news began to surface about the same time I joined the McCormick Foundation as journalism program director in the fall of 2005. A year later, Harvard Shorenstein Center and the Fund for Independent Journalism reported that never in our lifetime has there been a greater need for independent, high-quality journalism in the United States. Certainly the same can be said in 2015, maybe even more so. We in the foundation world are painfully aware of the downside of digitalization on traditional news media organizations, mainly their reduced commitment to serious journalism, and with it a heavy cost to communities in the reduction of information to monitor those in power. It all comes back to the important role of the Fourth Estate as the watchdog as a core element of democracy. You know, this diminished flow of news and information is especially noticeable in the coverage of local and state government. And for every carefully chronicled zig and zag made by Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton, there are scores of government agencies and contractors facing little, if any, scrutiny. The early years of the 21st century were dominated by a number of Future of Journalism conferences. How many did we all go to? And they recognized the dire need for the nonprofit journalism news models and the necessity of foundations to support the movement. By 2009, the Investigative News Network was formed by 27 nonprofit publishers, some of whom are sitting in the audience today. And as the numbers of local news, investigative, and public service journalism organizations increased, so did the level of support from the funders. It was a marriage of both convenience and need. You know, all told, McCormick invested about $8 million in nonprofit news in the past decade. But there are limitations to foundation support. Steve Waldman, who many of you know is the author of both the FCC report and the Council on Foundations Working Group, said there are too few foundations. They do not come close to replacing what was lost during the newspaper collapse and only cover a fraction of the need. To be blunt, not enough philanthropic money is going to support journalism right now. Of the $1.8 billion of philanthropy that went to media over the last 3 years, roughly $527 million went to journalism, news, and information. But only $27 million, about 1.5% of the total, went to investigative journalism. Indeed, as much as philanthropic money went to interactive games as went to investigative reporting. You know, a large chunk of the money that was given to journalism funders came from, you know, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Knights, who had sufficient involvement there's been insufficient involvement of the titans of the 21st century who've capitalized on the digital economy, and I'm referring to companies like Apple and Google. And there's evidence that the enthusiasm for this cost may have plateaued. According to the media impact funders, the total amount of funding for journalism, news, and information dropped from $186 million in 2009 to $167 million in 2012. The report estimate, the FCC report, the original FCC report, estimated it would take between $265 million and $1 billion to fill the current gaps in local reporting, depending on how one defined the need. Meanwhile, McCormick and the other foundations were hopeful that many of the nonprofit sites would develop sound management practices, adopt successful fundraising strategies, understand the importance of sustainability, and create evaluation models that showcase the impact of their work. What we didn't expect were the Internal Revenue Service hurdles impeding the ability of nonprofit news organizations to gain tax-exempt status. In 2012, Knight issued a grant to the Council on Foundations, which led to the 2013 report on the IRS and the nonprofit media. Now, I think this afternoon's conference is an ideal time to review the state of the nonprofit news movement, how it is working within the tax system, and how it is moving closer to sustainability. Now, I have three broad conclusions as far as the reflections on the work to date. First, I believe it is essential that the IRS de-emphasize the relevance of the operational distinction between nonprofit and for-profit media organizations in the matter of how content is distributed. The second, the importance of counting news and journalism as educational under tax-exempt status. And third, the IRS should focus on whether the news organization provides a community benefit without serving as a platform for private interests. That makes it imperative for not-for-profit news organizations to document, interpret, and analyze the value of the community benefits they provide. Now, as far as sustainability is concerned, foundations and researchers have closely monitored the financial and editorial impact of nonprofit news organizations. Knight research released in April identified strong growth among many of the 20 groups studied in the period ending in 2013. Those making the most progress towards sustainability seem to have an unwavering geographic or subject or community focus that is then able to control expenses, analyze digital traffic, raise funds from local donors, and create revenue-generating events. Now, while earned income, event sponsorship, robust social media numbers, a sound mobile strategy, and other audience engagement inroads are important, most non-for-profit sites will continue to look for foundations for, I would say, at least half of their future funding. Now, a good mix going forward might be 45% of the budget coming from foundations, 35% from subscription and individual donors, and maybe 25% from this new activity of earned income through events, advertising, training, and consulting services. In the future, it's what and how you deal with earned income that may be of concern to the IRS, state, and local taxing agencies. You know, prior to joining McCormick, I was editor of the nation's premier business news magazine for healthcare executives. And believe me, there was constant talk and concern among tax-exempt hospitals about non-patient revenue. So earned income really is a subject we need to address here today. Indeed, tax-exempt status carries with it obligations and responsibilities. I anticipate that surviving not-for-profit news outlets will deal with the organizational and financial parts of the equation in a sensible manner. What most interests me as a foundation executive is impact measurement. However, as the Knight study showed, investment and experimentation in assessment has been limited. While a few groups such as ProPublica, the Center for Investigative Reporting, Wisconsin Watch, and the Center for Public Integrity are doing a worthwhile job on evaluation, many others are lagging. What's needed are more sophisticated efforts for tracking data beyond basic website analytics. Foundations certainly want their grantees to capture more meaningful data about audience engagement, impact, and maybe social or legislative changes brought about by the work. Some of you may know John Sotsky's Knight Strategy and Assessment Director, and he says progress was uneven among the 20 not-for-profit news organizations he studied. Here's a good quote from John. "Sustainability remains a distant reality for most." That's why it is so important to continue the research, spotlight best practices, encourage innovation, and stay current with the tax cases and legislation that can affect your news gathering business model. Finally, let's see what the future holds. I think this fundamental reshaping of the news media industry will continue, and that will range from the global expansion efforts of Google, Facebook, Apple, and the New York Times to the desire for better local coverage by sharing resources and improving, the quality and caliber of coverage. Watch for more news partnerships involving not-for-profit news organizations, public radio and television, universities, civics groups, citizens advocacy centers, and cultural institutions. The goal of these distinctive partnerships will be to bolster the virtues of local democracy and public sector accountability. This may threaten certain stakeholders who work for, contract with, regulate, or manipulate government and public policy. But the fact is, strong local news organizations are essential for a strong democracy. In an era of big government, big data, big business, and big political parties, local and startup news outlets will require ample public and private support to adequately fulfill their important roles as watchdogs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celia and Clark. And we will have questions from the audience at the end, as I noted. But as the MC of the day, I will use my prerogative to ask one question before we move to the next panel, because we do have a couple of minutes. So, Clark, picking up on the comment you just made about elections and the obsession that you noted early in your comments we have about every move in the presidential election forum, yet the importance of the state and local, and in fact I would argue that the changes that really make a difference, many of the changes that really make a difference in people's lives are decided at the local and state level, and yet a lot of times the coverage of those elections gets short shrift. Celia noted that, of course, one of the areas where nonprofit media needs to tread carefully is in that forum, because there are limitations on what nonprofit media can and can't do, although there might be boundaries to test there. That said, when we look at the IRS and some of the concerns it's had around C4 organizations, we do, and where it might be focused in perhaps a next set of proposed regulations, we know that this whole area of political activity is potentially fraught with danger. And so, I wanted to ask each of you to comment upon what activities within the space of nonprofit media you think could serve to have a better informed electorate, which of course is part of building a strong civil society, with regard to the state and the local elections and the ongoing activities of state and local legislative and administrative bodies.
Well, I can talk about it just from a tax law standpoint, but I'm sure Clark can do a much better job of talking about it from an effectiveness standpoint. So from a tax law standpoint, there's a lot that can be done, and it's really voter education. It's really bringing to the attention of the public what the different candidates' positions are, what they stand for, what are the issues in the race. And as long as that's all done in a balanced and nonpartisan fashion, meaning that you're not trying to tilt it in favor of one candidate or the other, then nonprofit media can be a fabulous resource. You can be a fabulous resource both in what's published and what's on your website, and there are absolutely no restrictions in doing that at all. And we all listen to, or many of us I'm sure listen to public radio, and we know that there's a lot of coverage at the national level. As you say, every time Barack Obama, makes a little, jog here or jog there for a photo opportunity. But doing more, national public broadcasting is not going to cover the state and local races, but a lot can be done there. There are a lot of 501c3 organizations outside the media space that are doing a lot to try to do voter education, and civic engagement is equally important. Getting the voters educated is important, but civic engagement, getting them interested in the issues and willing to go out and vote, is also important. And there are really no limits there in terms of what can be done, as long as it's all nonpartisan, balanced, even-handed.
And really reflect on good government. I think it's quite logical for a not-for-profit news site to interpret what the candidates are saying on the issues, maybe hold candidates accountable by having them sign pledges of certain good government type moves or legislation. I think that you got to be very careful when it comes to endorsements. I would lay off those as much as possible. And then finally, going back to this partnership situation, Lucy Daglish from University of Maryland was just telling me about some newspapers in a nearby county in Maryland that have been terminated by the Washington Post, and what that means to local community news coverage. The Sunlight Foundation, Tom Glazer's organization. These are national resources and sometimes local university that can help these local news outlets provide the right kind of material that then generate the kind of civic engagement CELIA is talking about.
Great. Now, both CELIA and Clark will be available for additional questions afterward. So right now, what I'd like to do is transition to our next panel. While I introduce our moderator, Kevin Murphy, I do want to invite to come up to the stage Peter BALE, Tom Glazer, who was just mentioned, RITA HENLEY JENSEN, and Maureen Nelson. And with that, we'll move to our next panel. We heard about the IRS, what's going on there. We heard about some of the practical issues around foundations in this space of nonprofit media, some of the concerns, some of the growth and development of this field and what might be needed next. And now we'd like to hear from those who are on the ground actually doing this work and what their experience has been. And so to moderate that panel, I would like to introduce you all to Kevin Murphy. Kevin is with the Berks County Community Foundation, and in fact, he was its first employee back in 1994. He now serves as president and chief executive officer, where he supervises the business and operations of the foundation and serves on its board of directors. Now, Kevin is the most recent past chair of the Council on Foundations Board as well. I do need to let you know in the interest of full disclosure. And he has taken a deep personal and professional interest in this issue of nonprofit media. In fact, he has published multiple commentaries on the subject, including a couple of those in Huffington Post over the past few years. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Kevin to introduce you to our panel and carry on the conversation.
Well, thank you, Sue, and welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this event and to continue an important conversation about the future of nonprofit journalism that the Council's been involved with now for several years. I'm in the odd position of being the non-journalist up here with a bunch of, and I'm supposed to ask the questions to the journalists, and we really have a wonderful group of people. What I want to do is introduce each of them briefly and give each of them 1 or 2 minutes to talk about their function in the world of nonprofit journalism, and then we'll go to some questions that we've developed, and at the end, questions that are coming in from you and from viewers online. So starting at the far end here, Peter BALE is the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity and a former employee of CNN, where he ran their websites. And Peter, if you can tell us a little bit about what the Center for Public Integrity is doing in this space.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin, and thanks very much for the Council on Foundations for having this. I think Clark and CELIA have raised some extraordinarily important issues that are central to our work every day. The Center for Public Integrity is in a struggle for permanent relevance and impact, like any non-profit media organization. It won the 2014 Pulitzer for Investigative Journalism with an extraordinary story that you might think could only have come out of the 1960s, which was about collusion between medics at Johns Hopkins and coal companies to suppress the evidence of black lung disease amongst coal miners. You know, these kind of stories are still going on, and so much of what we do ends up being about disenfranchised communities, ill-informed people, inequality, if you like. And it's very clear to me as a newcomer, as you can tell from my voice, to the United States, that inequality is at the heart of so much of what we do, and regrettably, inequality is no longer a non-partisan issue, perhaps. But we are a non-partisan news organization. We're dedicated to that. When we think about the theory of change that most of the foundations in here are working towards, we're in the awareness, the impact, and the combating ignorance business. We're not in the advocacy business, and that's been true since the organization was founded 25 years ago by Chuck Lewis, who many of you will know. I'm sure during the course of the conversation we'll pick up on these areas about local. We're doing extraordinary work at the state and local level, and I want to emphasize that and to come up with possibly some ideas here, which I'd love some of the bigger foundations to get behind, because I think a lot of this is going to be about technology. And I think we all have to adopt technology more aggressively than we have, and not expect lovely foundations to continue to support us just because we're the nicest people in town and doing God's work.
Let me introduce you, Rita. Rita HENLEY JENSEN is the founder of Women's E-News, which is an interesting site if you haven't been to it. Rita, tell us about Women's E-News and your trip there.
We founded in 2000. We were early adapters, and we are under the education provision of the IRS code, and we didn't have a problem. I just wanted to fill in a little bit of background about me. This is like one of the best days of my life. On Women's E-News, they posted a 1,200-word story written by myself. I love journalism. I'm extremely proud of that story. And we're in partnership, Clark, with WNYC and PRI. So we've heard about the partnership idea. It's great. So doing it a little rocky, but it's great. So my dad was the business editor for the Journal in Columbus, Ohio, and my mother told us repeatedly that he had to vote Republican to keep his job. True or not, the belief was reflected in the Journal's news product throughout. I'm of the next generation. I came of age in the 60s and 70s. It's strongly influenced by the civil rights and the women's rights movement. So after graduation from Columbia Journalism School, I wanted my journalism to reflect the values of equality and freedom and not report through a conservative lens. And I still do. In 1995, after 30 years or so as a prize-winning investigative journalist for newspapers and national journals, I was awarded an Alicia Patterson Fellowship to investigate the savings and loan scandal. This was at the same moment when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich successfully pushed the effort to end welfare as we know it. I was stunned by the racism and the gender bias embedded in all the news coverage that I saw of the proposed changes. And I decided I had to change the way journalism covered women's issues. Because if you cover welfare and women's poverty and dependence, you have to cover the issue of who pays child support and who doesn't. For whatever reason, violence against women, access to reproductive health care. Have you seen one story about Texas abortion clinics shutting down and the rise in single motherhood, for one thing? The women's low wages in careers when they are the majority, and there's so much more. So in 2000, I got this opportunity to launch a website, a news site covering women's issues, and I'm part of a privilege. Clark, if I had 45% of our revenue covered by foundations, I would start going to church. I'm telling you, I'd go back. So I'm not sure any commercial news media would be able to reproduce the type of commercial coverage we do, the type of news coverage that we do, given their need for an upscale audience to attract audience and the gender, race, and class of their management. Now, so I wanted to show you a couple of examples. Do we have my PowerPoint? Do I see it? Oh, there it is. Next. So this is a story we did in 2014. Is that the one that says the refugees in Jordan? Have you seen one story about the consequences of the mass migration on the women? Are they not being raped? Are they not being married off? Sold off in marriage? Not one. If I had the revenue, I would put somebody on a plane to tell that story. That's an important aspect of that story. And the next, this is 2011, and at that time, 84% of the pregnant women who died as a result of embolism were black, and 0% were white. And I keep saying, we're talking about dead moms here. This is a news story. It's a community story. It's a story you could do in any community. But we did it because we care. And then today's story, which is next. This is a story that I did today, and that is picked up by WNYC and PRI. African American women in New York City at the current, we don't know at the current, it's an old, it's just released, but it's old data, died 12 times as often as white women, and that's primarily because the mortality rate dropped for white women substantially. That's alarming, and that's our job. And this is just one example of a lot of the news coverage is about abortion rights and blah, blah, blah. This is about the right to have a life and a family. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rita. Marie Nelson. Marie is the Vice President for News and Public Affairs at a small nonprofit called PBS.
Indeed. Well, we like to think of ourselves as a news organization that wants to have its cake and eat it too. Certainly continuing the legacy of things like the PBS NewsHour and PBS NewsHour Weekend, which I will brag and say is the only nightly news anchored by two women, and on the weekend, the only anchored show with a South Asian American host. Of course, all of the investigative journalism work that we're doing through Frontline, the ongoing, news conversations through Charlie Rose and Charlie Rose the Week. We've got Washington Week. We've got journalism that extends through our independent film series, Independent Lens and POV. So in that sense, there's always going to be a commitment to use the broadcast medium to do what we do best in terms of providing news and information to the American public. But the Eat It Too part of it is a recognition that we need to expand those audiences, that we need to, adopt the patterns of the disruptors that are important in terms of where the industry's heading. We need to figure out the right partnerships that are going to enable us to expand our editorial voice and our editorial impact. And all of those things are things that we're actively working on, both with our national programs and in our partnerships with our local stations. So for PBS, I think that we see this as a very exciting opportunity and a place where we can really build and figure out how to continue to refine and build that business model to make sure that we're servicing communities and that we're making ourselves indispensable to the communities that we serve.
Great. And finally, Tom Glazer, a fellow funder who's the program director for informed participation at the Democracy Fund.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to Council on Foundations, and also the good work of Steve Waldman and his merry band back in 2013. Thanks, Clark. This is clearly an important issue around nonprofit journalism. There are gaps, they need to be filled, and commercial institutions are not there to fill them. We at the Democracy Fund are, self-evidently, I suppose, interested in a resilient democracy. Really a political system able to withstand new challenges and address the questions put in front of politicians. For us, part of that is requires a vibrant media and active citizens. And that's what's driven us to create this is one of three programs. We have a program focused on governance. I like to say the functionality of Congress, but often it's the dysfunctionality of Congress and strengthening that. A second focused on elections, questions of election administration, and campaign finance. And the third is the work I direct around what we call informed participation. And that covers in a major focus around local journalism and other focuses around the possibilities of engagement. And a third leg of the stool is accountability journalism and fact-checking. And I'm very pleased to count Peter Bale's organization among our grantees who do great work.
And we're very grateful for counting you amongst our supporters too, Tom. Thank you.
Isn't that wonderful?
It's love.
I put in an ask.
Yeah, she did.
Well, thank you. Now, before we started this, Sue said to me, Kevin, you better explain why the guy running a $70 million community foundation in Reading, Pennsylvania is up here talking about community or about journalism and news. And the fact is that Reading, Pennsylvania is in a county about 411,000 people. And we've always been our own media market. Nobody in Philadelphia has ever been terribly interested in us. They think everything west of Valley Forge is Erie. And like you might imagine, it was dominated by a family-owned daily newspaper that has struggled as family-owned daily newspapers have for a period of time. The Community Foundation was the largest shareholder in that as a result of a bequest, which gave us, if nothing else, a really clear insider's view of the struggles of running a daily newspaper. So our community foundation is obviously, like almost every one of the 750 community foundations in this country, very deeply concerned about the flow of information in our community. It's basically the oxygen that allows us to work every day. We know that we have to have a local media presence. that holds government accountable. I come from a county whose coroner was indicted for public corruption once upon a time. Now, I urge you to spend a minute and think about a corrupt coroner. Welcome to Pennsylvania. But we also know that this is how people identify within their community and learn what's going on and educate them about issues. So we've undertaken a variety of strategies, including attempting, with pretty mixed results, to convert a public access television station to online news presence. We've now started our own quarterly news magazine where we're hiring independent journalists to cover in-depth, big local issues. We've expanded a neighboring county's Spanish language public radio station into our county with grants. And we are very much, as I think all of the folks here, a work in progress, trying to figure out what this looks like, but our particular interest is at the local level, which allows me to sort of tee up my first question to the whole group, each of whom looks at this from a different perspective. While we used to get all of our news across the same platforms, the Reading Eagle had national news, and it had international news, and it had State House news, and it had the corrupt coroner coverage. We're entering this period where the news is fracturing into lots of different ways of delivery, and many of them focused on national and global issues. And my question to the panel is, does anybody have a sense of what's going to work to deliver local news over the long term?
Fundamentally, I mean, we all know that, local news really was in many ways synonymous with newspapers, and we know what's going on with the newspaper industry. We've still got, unemployment rates last year of 10%, pretty much as high as it's been since the financial fallout. And, even though, of course, local television news has always continued to be important, when you look at those institutions and you think about where we're headed, I don't think that anybody, there's no one who will deny the fact that local news just really is in peril. And I think that as long as the trend lines continue, where you see, audiences continuing to turn to digital services, you see folks looking for different ways to stream the news. I think that there's always going to be a challenge, and I think that within the public broadcasting system, one of the ways that we've worked to try to shore that up, quite honestly, is to put more resources and more effort into developing local journalism centers to create some base of resources so that those stations have the opportunity to try to continue to provide more original reporting, to do things to diversify their newsrooms, to do things that will continue to make them relevant within their communities. And so, at least from the public broadcasting side, there's a recognition that these changes have to be met with additional resources to support local news, because those local resources simply do not exist the way that they did before.
I'd like to add a comment. I'm on national and international news, so you can discount whatever I have to say. But what I think is the hegemony of the white male definition of news, which is, when I was in the newsroom, what happened to the editor was news, and and women's news was what happened to the editor's wife. That's and no one even remembers that. It seems to me that the very nature of community is changing, and we've seen a massive influx. I think a lot in Minnesota. First we saw Hmongs, and then we saw Somalians, and we see Mexicans. And to have the capacity, which would take money, but the capacity to expand the definition of community. We all know that the newspapers fled to the suburbs in the 60s. If they expand the definition of community, which, by the way, does not include women, just a sore point, that might, in fact, be really wonderfully productive. And in New York, how many ethnic newspapers are there that are daily? You can't believe how many, and they're surviving.
May I add something to that, Kevin? And apart from that, I want to ask you out to dinner, please, Rita, because I find that quite really interesting, and I think we've got a lot in common, despite me being a white
Wow.
middle-aged male.
We got some grants going. We got dinner dates set up.
Exactly.
This is awesome.
I've often been a little bit provocative about this, and I'll come at it partly from an overseas point of view, from an English point of view, if you like, which is that we do need to remember that most of the local newspapers, most of the main city newspapers, pretty much took their audiences for granted. They completely failed to defend their own classified business from the likes of Craigslist, and they really didn't do a very good job of running themselves. They did, and their editorial direction completely ignored the shifts in their own communities, whether that's for women or ethnic groups. And I think, when I walk home now up Connecticut Avenue, there are 10, 20, 30 newspaper boxes there for Hispanic newspapers, for the fantastic, and I have people giving away Street Sense, or selling me Street Sense, I'm sorry, nobody gives it away. There are pockets of community there that are being very, very well served by their newspapers. Even the DuPont Current, which I think is my local newspaper, is extremely good because it can also tell me things about my area. And I think that sense of locality, sense of location, and sense of purpose. The trouble is they killed their own business model on the way through by not binding themselves to the fact that people would engage with their advertising in the way that Craigslist did. So I think that is partly self-inflicted injuries, but I think that this will be the saviour of local news. The trouble is it's still relatively expensive to publish on it, but it will be about proximity, locality, and the weather. I think there was one I had in mind a minute ago about the WAMU's deal with the Weather Gang in the Washington from the Washington Post is a very clever piece of local publishing, I think, because what do people care about? It's whether you're going to take an umbrella to work. At least that's what we think about in London, anyway.
To answer your question, Kevin, about what's it going to take to solve it, I think at some level, and I'll come back to this in a second, it's an all of the above answer. But I just want to focus in on the scale of the problem. We recently commissioned some research in New Jersey from Professor Rutgers, and he compared the amount of news available at a local level to citizens of Newark, New Brunswick, and Morristown. So all three different cities really representing the ends of the state in terms of the economics. And if you think about Morristown, a small, wealthy city, it has 12 news sources for every 20,000 citizens, and Newark had 1. In terms of the amount of news available to a citizen of Morristown on their local area, it was 23 times the amount of news, in terms of the number of news stories around issues of concern to the local community. Those are profound and very stark differences. And we sometimes all look to social media to complement this. There isn't, the difference there in social media was not 23 times, but 20 times. And so if we think about filling this gap, we also have to think about the variability of this gap across the country. And this is not a small gap to be filled. And when I said an all of the above solution, I think there's and Peter talked about the Weather Gang and WAMU, there's something about places finding their niche and really filling the niche they can and partnering where they can't. And these are going to create rather odd marriages of convenience between traditionally very competitive commercial outlets who should remain commercial and seek to returns for their shareholders, and partnering where they aren't well equipped with non-profit outlets that can do the sort of investigative reporting that others can't. And there is some interesting work going on in New Jersey around this. I think of sort of the New Jersey Spotlight, a small investigative outlet, partnering with NJ.com, part of Advanced Media. It works pretty well. The NJ Spotlight does the investigative stuff and gets the distribution and thus the recognition from the people who support the philanthropically funded work by distributing it through the commercial outlet. And these are delicate things to negotiate. They aren't always successful, and I'm sure they will create profound challenges for the lawyers. But that, for me, is where we're going to find a solution. It is all of the above and collaboration across the ecosystem.
Great. And so later time, I'm going to put you and me on the spot about philanthropy funding of journalism, but the opposite of the idea of local news is obviously national news. And Peter, I know you're relatively new, but we have a presidential election next year.
So I've heard, yeah.
He missed it. Really?
And I'm wondering, as a longtime journalist, if you want to reflect on the role of the nonprofit media, given the limitations that we've talked about relative to endorsements and partisanship, in a big presidential election where the media has begun to define the terms of the election by deciding sort of who will be considered candidates, right?
Yeah.
And suspicions among voters about whether that's necessarily driven by journalism as much as perhaps audience demographics. What's the role for nonprofit media in this big national debate we're having?
Well, I think it's very extensive, actually, and we are trying to choose our moments in this. We're bringing back a brand that Chuck Lewis made very successful, I think, in the mid-90s, called Buying of the Presidency. And we will be doing that on an earned income basis with a major broadcaster, where they will effectively be, I can't tell you who it is because it's, as Tom says, these things take a little while to do, but it will effectively be outsourcing to us the investigative aspect of these stories. We have done what amount to listicles, 10 things you need to know about Hillary Rodham Clinton, or 9 things about Lawrence Lessig today, because it keeps us in the game, and we make them very shareable on social, and it keeps us in the conversation. It is essential for us to stay part of the political conversation, and one of our reporters, Dave Leventhal, is frequently on Al Jazeera here, and is a regular kind of commentator. But we can't participate in the day-to-day generally. So what we're trying to do is participate very actively on social media. We tweet a lot. We're working on how to bring that more effectively back into the site. But I think the project that we're about to announce shortly is the one you're talking about, really, is all the most relevant, which is where a major broadcaster has decided to work with us on the historic depth of where these people have got their money from over their entire political histories. So it's not, I think everyone feels as though they've read everything they can ever read about Hillary. Everybody feels as though they know about Jeb Bush, but there is still new stuff there. There are still connections to be made. I mean, we saw it yesterday with the announcement about the emails and who's the person who's going to be vetting that discussion at the State Department. These connections just perpetually come out, and it needs investigative work to uncover the kind of known unknowns, if you like, of these people. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this particular case. It is very hard for us to stay relevant during a campaign that is so enormous. But I think then there's also a states level aspect of that, and there are state elections going on at the same time, and we're working with, we have a project about to launch at the end of November called States Integrity, which again is an old idea that we have brought back, and it will give A to F ratings, and you can imagine who gets an F for transparency, for effectiveness in the states. So, and this is work that we've hired 50 journalists in all of the state houses around the country. It's fully in partnership with the local newspapers in each of those, many of the local newspapers in each of those states, and broadcast media. So it is a way for an investigative news organization to do work that might otherwise not be done, to distribute it very effectively, and to support local media at the same time. But it's finding the right place to intervene. And I do want to ask, when we come to the end, the CELIA question about earned income is very, very interesting, because I'm extremely proud of this deal with a broadcaster, but the idea that it's ever going to become sort of 10 or 15 or more % of our income is very difficult to imagine right now. But I do think it's essential that we start finding effective ways to charge or substitute for other people's costs in doing this kind of thing.
Well, yeah, Peter, if you can't cover isn't the day-to-day guy, but you are. Do these rules, are they a problem?
I tell you, you are talking to me at a very sensitive moment because literally for the last 2 months I've been holed up in my office trying to figure out all of the components for our election strategy for next year. But I must say that we're excited. We're excited about where we are because you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things we continue to revisit, especially in a resource-challenged environment, is do we need to do all of the things that the cables are doing and the networks are doing in terms of how we cover politics in the election? And at the end of the day, when we sat down and we look at the numbers of our viewers who are turning to us during our elections coverage, when we cover the conventions, when we do continue to weigh in, it's incredibly significant. In fact, over the last several national elections, during the conventions, our PBS audience has been significantly up above our primetime average. So even though it's a significant, amount of money to drive towards those expensive aspects of our coverage, there's a recognition that it's still important for us to do that. But at the same time, this was one of the areas where we felt like we really could make a strategic partnership that was going to take us into new territory. And so for the first time next year, NPR and PBS are joining hands, and we're going to co-broadcast a lot of things related to the election, from campaign, all along the campaign trail to the conventions. We'll be simulcasting both on NPR and on PBS stations. This was something that I couldn't believe had not happened up until now, but we're incredibly proud that we're laying the groundwork to create an effort that will really, in some ways, make the elections more public than they've ever been before. So looking for those areas of collaboration has been important. Looking for partnerships with folks like the Atlantic and with social media partners like Facebook. All of those things have been important, and we're approaching it in ways that we've never done. Like we have, Frontline has a 3-part series called My Brother's Bomber that looks at the experience of a journalist whose brother was killed in the Lockerbie bombings. And it's not going to premiere on PBS. It's actually going to premiere on Roku. So thinking about how we build in the right partnerships and create a network that's going to allow us to expand what we're doing is incredibly important to us now.
For Women's E-News, it's really, really easy. The Republican Party has done us a big favor. There's maybe 3 pro-choice Republicans, there may be more, but we cover the congressional races extensively where women are running for both Republican and Democrat, and we identify, and there are pro-choice Republican women. And by pro-choice, I also mean pro-contraception, if you know what's going on in Congress about Planned Parenthood. So we don't have to endorse anybody. We just have to identify their position for our audience.
So Tom, when all the for-profit media has done its job and these great nonprofit outlets have done its job, how confident are you that you'll have informed participation in the presidential election?
I don't think democracy, the work of democracy, is ever finished. I think we are in a moment of profound transition in media, and the models are, we are responding both in terms of the formats, the platforms on which journalism is delivered, and the institutions that produce it. I think it's going to be a tough election in terms of coverage. One area that we have been very interested in is around fact-checking as an innovation in a format at the national level and at the state level. So I think many of you will be familiar with PolitiFact or with Fact Check in the Washington Post awarding Pinocchios for less than truthful statements. We commissioned some research in 2012 at the state level where there's relatively little fact-checking, and it gave us half a hope that if a politician was fearful of being fact-checked around the truth, they lied half as much. Now, this isn't really cause for too much hope, but it's definitely cause for. There are things and innovations that can be taken by outlets that aren't requiring massive investments in some newfangled technology or different cost model that outlets can adopt, and through multiple iterations and multiple innovations and iterations here, we will see a better journalism with robust institutions arise. But glass half full, glass half empty. I'm afraid it's a moment of transition.
So there was an interesting set of articles in the Stanford Social Innovation Review that just came out. I don't know when it came out. I got it yesterday when I got back from vacation, about funding media and measuring the impact. And one of the things that's clear is that some journalists and some funders aren't in alignment. But one of the things that a lot of funders are looking for is journalism that encourages people to become involved and engaged in their communities. Marie, you've been a television news producer for years from a TV news perspective, as opposed to this notion of just purely informing people, but actually in getting them engaged. What's the role of television news, and particularly nonprofit television news, in that?
Well, as we all know, there are some pretty clear lines that we certainly work not to cross, but we do think that that in the area of journalism, public affairs writ large, that there is a natural opportunity, especially for organizations like PBS that are member organizations, and who live and die by the success of their member stations, to work to connect with audiences on the ground that are concerned about things that are important to the community. Perfect example, right now PBS is in the final throes of producing a 1-hour special that's going to air on the 21st, which is called America After Charleston. And that was a production that came to us from South Carolina ETV. Obviously, after the murders in Charleston, there was a lot of concern about having a conversation within the community that takes us from this moment and that extends us to all of the issues that come out of that story. So working to support the efforts of local newsrooms and local member stations on the ground on important stories that touch the community and that engage the community will always be an important part of the public broadcasting mission. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to continue to do more of these types of programs.
Kevin, can I add something to that? Because I think this is really important for the foundations in the room as well, because it is sometimes the bridge between the journalistic organizations and the advocacy groups. And I think we need to be clear about what those bridges are, that they're a bit porous sometimes, because the BBC, for example, in the UK is often very, very good in this and has a mandate to do it, which is if you've been affected by the story, here are four organizations to get in touch with, whether it's a story that might have affected you about refugees or some sort of personal crisis. And I think we need to get into that space a little bit more and say, if you're concerned about a story or the story's affected you, here's ways to take further action. And I know solutions journalism does that. The whole field is called solutions journalism. But I know, for example, my team is extremely nervous about the idea about this. We had a terrific case recently of a story, a very classic centre story about the imprisonment or incarceration of children in American schools. So it had a fantastic anecdote about an 11-year-old autistic boy in Virginia. But the most important aspect of that story was not the anecdote in a sense, it was the fact that we had data for every one of the 50 states, which happened to show that Virginia was the worst in the country for imprisoning or treating kids like common criminals. There has been change as a result of that legislatively, but change.org picked that up. There was a petition about this particular boy signed by 160,000 people. My team were very nervous about picking up and promoting that because that takes them into the advocacy space. And I think we need to make that a safer space to go into, because that's what you want. You do want, nobody wants stories to just fall flat on the floor. They've got to be picked up by somebody, but it's that role of who picks them up, how they get accelerated, and I think we have a role, all of us have a role in somehow making those connections a little more obvious to make those stories land and have impact more than just by the very fact of them being published.
And Rita, how does your organization think about that question?
Well, again, we're very concerned about being an advocate. On the other hand, we think that we have really solid connections with national advocacy organizations. And one of the things when we started Women's E-News is how do we define news? I was criticized how other people define news. And our definition becomes essentially by covering civil society, that's where the ideas come from and the data come from. So by constantly covering them, we've had meetings like, okay, what do we want to do with Planned Parenthood? We have no relationship with Planned Parenthood. ACL does all the litigation. We have no relationship with the ACLU. But we're challenged to grow our audience. And shouldn't the ACLU's audience and Planned Parenthood's audience and welfare rights advocates or whatever poverty centers, shouldn't we connect with them somehow? We haven't resolved that puzzle.
I'll just add, Kevin, on the boundary between impact and sort of influence from foundations. And I think the articles in SSIR are indicative of a healthy dialogue about how we draw the lines. There is, foundations want to see impact in that people have read the story and that it's out there. There's a temptation with grantees to be funded, and if we don't draw those lines clearly, I think people will inadvertently perhaps overstep them. I know Peter BALE, I know Carrie Levine, I know John Dunbar. I know they'll write stories on me if it was a good story. I have no doubts of their integrity, but we need more than just that to draw this line properly. I think it will be very good when that really dialogue continues. So.
Before we bring folks back and go to the questions, Tom, I didn't give you a heads up on this, but it's fair game for funders. We now have these emerging nonprofit news stories, and foundations have been key funders, as was pointed out, in getting those started, because foundations are great at starting things, but the field has institutional ADD and thinks that 3 years is a really long commitment and 5 years is a really like a career bender kind of commitment. And yet I suspect that neither you or I believe that in the next 5 years we will have cracked this code and created a network of self-sustaining nonprofit journalism enterprises that deliver news all over the world. How do we encourage foundations? Is this a time that we have to encourage foundations? And if so, how do we encourage foundations to think differently about their role relative to an issue?
Right. So I agree with you that 5 years is too far in the future to ever think about. So, but we are faced with a world where some foundations invest in innovating in an area and sort of intervening and making changes, and others are more willing to invest in sort of sustaining and supporting the status quo. And there are far too few who do that. And I mean, PBS has been lucky to secure many funders who year on year stick with PBS and NPR in a good way. But there are very few out there. So I think there is a need to do that. I think it's not only at with philanthropic foundations, but with the public. The idea of crowdfunding and Indiegogo and the like being I call it the tote bag of the 21st century. As an opportunity is something that I think we should think about more deeply. And of course, I have to throw it back to you. The area where this is most profoundly needed is at the local level with community foundations, like yours. which is great.
Yeah, and I would say that when community foundations have their most significant meetings at a bar, when the council on foundations has a conference, and the conversation at the bar is that the community foundations think this is something they've got to make an ongoing, permanent budgetary commitment toward for the foreseeable future, because I think most of the community foundations who have thought through this have not seen at a local level an emerging economic strategy that subsidizes journalism in the way that advertising used to. And nobody imagines government funding at a local level. I guarantee you that the Reading City Council will not vote to fund a daily newspaper to investigate their current bribery scandal there. I guarantee it. But I think it's a conversation that's only started in the field of philanthropy.
I agree.
And is still rooted in the notion that we're going to create these models that will sustain themselves somehow. So.
Kevin? What happened to legal advertising, right? Is that still limited to paper advertising? Because every paper I worked for got legal advertising from the city council and all the regulation, all the agencies that were required. Has any of that migrated to nonprofit?
Pennsylvania still requires that legal advertising be done in a daily newspaper. And there was an attempt to change that to allow the communities to use online legal advertising, and that failed. But it's only a fraction of the newspaper's total revenue.
Well, for speaking with the nonprofit sector, any money's good.
Yeah, so right to the Pennsylvania legislature. I want to thank the panelists here. Sue's coming back up. We're going to invite the first group up and then deal with questions from the audience and also from the online audience. Right,
Absolutely. Thank you to this panel for this intro. Let's first give them a round of applause. I have one question that I have been thinking of as this panel's been going on. We have a couple that have come in through Twitter, plus, of course, we invite any of you, of course, to come to. We have 2 microphones in the room. You can come up and post your questions there. And then for those of you who are joining us virtually, again, you can use Twitter. So, as I've been listening to the panel, and as I think of my own experience just day to day, I want news on something. It could be local, it could be national, it could be international, and I'll type into my Google search engine, the issue that I want, and a bunch of stuff pops up. And some of the resources are very familiar to me. I know the New York Times, I know USA Today, I know the Wall Street Journal. So I also know a little bit about them. I know their point of view. And so it's kind of, I have a little bit of a lens through which I'm reading some things. But there's an awful lot that pops up that I have never heard of before. And so therefore, there's a really interesting issue, I think, with regard to our scrutiny of what is available to us as news, what it would be called news, that we can gather online. And so if we think about the title of this particular conversation we're having and thinking about a vibrant and informed civil society, I think a lot of that is also grounded in the integrity of the information we're getting and the scrutiny that we're putting to it. And Marie, I'm reminded, Gwen Eiffel joined us at a council conference within the past year, and there's a project I know she's very, very proud of that she does with young people around really embedding this sense of scrutinizing what you see online so that you can be well-informed and sort of right-informed. RITA's media outlet has a clear point of view, but it's clear on its face what its point of view is. Women E-News kind of tells you right up front what it is, right? So I wonder in this space of nonprofit media, and I wonder in this space of things that foundations might be looking at, the role that nonprofit media might play in helping our citizens really scrutinize what they're seeing so that they are a well-informed participant in civil society and not necessarily someone who's just reading a lot that may or may not be true. So thoughts on that?
Happy to jump in. We've been doing a lot of work just to gear up for how it is that we try to reach new audiences, especially as we gear up for the election year. And one of the things that we've done is gone out and put these questions to viewer panels, and then we've also been on the receiving end of that. And what we consistently hear from our viewers is that one of the reasons why they turn to PBS is because they value its credibility. They find it as a trustworthy source for news. And I say that not to pat us on the back, but just to say that I fundamentally believe that that's one of the important things that public broadcasting has to offer in the current media landscape, and that we really have to continue to advance that. That has to be one of our guiding lights and principles, and it's something that we need to trumpet. So even as we start thinking about how we build brand spots for elections coverage, that's what we want to remind the public, that is in fact a value that in some ways is imperiled as we look at all of the options that are available to us now, and that it's something that we see as being core to what we do every day in the provision of news and public affairs.
May I add something to that? Because I think it's very important also to realize that young people are not morons, and that their friendships, their connections, and the power of social media very, very quickly isolates stupidity and poorly sourced news and rubbish out there. And I think that it is a very yes, it can get out very quickly, but it can also get controlled extremely quickly. And I was thinking, Rita mentioned that editors and their wives were the focus groups for the entire newsroom before. Editors' families are also, and I think of my daughter's own habits in this, and Jezebel, Vagenda are very important parts of her reading, and I hope Women's E-News is going to become so as well. But I do think there is an important role for organisations like mine in the effective curation of the best that's out there, and putting our brand behind others, putting our endorsement, if you like, out there to the best of it. But to do that, we then have to look at things like the Atlanta Black Star and look out of our, New York Times, Washington Post kind of framework, which is not to say that we wouldn't include it from them. But I really think that there are so many outlets out there, and I think we can still have. There was something I saw lamenting that we don't have water cooler moments where we've all watched the same news. The picture of that little boy Aylan that was circulated within seconds of being taken by a Reuters photographer in Turkey the other day changed policy in 24 hours. We can, and we all saw 500 different versions of it. The newspapers that chose not to use it, I think, were mad. But it changed policy within 24 hours. So we can see that we can still have water cooler moments, if you like. They're just a lot faster before you can get to the water cooler.
And I guess by now I was so fascinated what Peter said that I lost track of what I wanted.
Thanks, that happens all the time.
We all draw from our life experiences. I have two 20-year-old sons. They and their friends are incredibly sophisticated at being critical of what comes in because they've been raised in an environment where they were deluged with information. So they're very quick, as Peter points out. What I think we see as a problem in our community is the other end of the spectrum, an older generation that believes that if it's in print, it must be true. I've had to tell my father a couple of times that the number of times FW appears in the subject line does not increase the validity of what's attached to it, right? But there's a generation that didn't have to be critical. My God, if it was in the Reading Eagle, it had been sourced and vetted, and it didn't get to print unless it had been that. So we struggle more in our community with older people having trouble sorting through those kinds of distinctions than kids.
Now I'm going to second what you have to say. When I tell my grandchildren to look something up in Wikipedia, they go, "Grandma, you can't trust Wikipedia." And that's discussed in school about the accuracy.
Well, I think this raises a very interesting point, right? A vibrant civil society has citizens of all ages, from all walks of life. And so I think it is something, this generational issue, something to consider. When I heard Eiffel talking about her project with the young people, I thought, boy, wouldn't that be even more significant with those who are older. And, I used to get my news through the print paper, and so I unfortunately have to identify on the older side of this. But, I think that it's something for us all to consider about how news gets disseminated and kind of what we're relying upon. So,
Sue, I have some to add. I think the point you bring up is just a reflection on the complexity of society and the volume of information out there. Some foundations like McCormick have invested in news literacy programs to address just the topics you're bringing up. And it's not only working with high school students, it goes down to early grades and even adult programs. And I think this is something that may be ingrained in the younger generation to be careful and cautious. But I think we all can use a dose of news literacy training every once in a while.
thank you, Clark. Now, we have a couple of questions that have come in through Twitter, but we also have somebody standing at the microphone. So why don't we take a live in-person question? If you just identify yourself and
Sure.
throw out your question.
Yeah, I'm Sharon Moshavi, with the International Center for Journalists. Question about audience engagement, which is a term that's been bandied around a lot today, as it is in every single journalism event you will go to now. I'd love to hear a couple of really specific examples, both from funders and media organizations, of projects you did that really were innovative ways of getting audience engagement. I'd like to know how that went, how you monitored it and evaluated it. And my last question is a follow-up to that is engagement. Are there different opportunities for engagement with nonprofit media, or is it across the board, whether you're for-profit or not-profit?
I'll take a stab at answering that question. We've got bring two examples to mind. Your question brings two examples to mind, one of which is the Engaging News project that we fund down in Texas, where a professor who's got a very practical sort of attitude to these questions has looked at innovations online to get us out of the sewer of the comment stream. I mean, that's part of it. And there are engagingnewsproject.org will take you there, but the one example that sticks with me is changing the like button to a respect button. Very interesting in that it actually increases engagement with the comment stream and increases engagement with counter-attitudinal comments. You may respect a comment that you may disagree with. And there are plenty of little things that Talia Stridis, her name, is really researching in service of news outlets to take their hunches about what works and what doesn't and say, this is actually what works. Changing your front page from what you would imagine as a traditional newspaper front page to something new resulted in, with their experiment, a 90% uptick in consumption. 90%. The other example of project, and I can point you directly to the person in the room, Craig Aaron, at the other end of the spectrum, who leads Free Press, is running a project in New Jersey that is bringing communities and newsrooms together very practically. Nothing technological about this. This is face-to-face discussions with the intent of responding to the sort of disengagement that a newsroom that may have been cut 10 times may have adopted as a result of having no one there to really get out into the community, and a community who've not seen themselves covered in the local news and thus have given up. And both those run the gamut, but Craig's a couple of tables away. So
we did a project the other day, which I'd love you to look at, called Fatal Extraction, which is a remarkable combination of video data, on-the-spot reporting in 13 African countries, and it's incredibly expensive to do. So one of the things that I would say here is that, because I'm a huge believer in having great journalism, great technology, and great funders, journalism is not cheap to produce. Innovation in journalism is not cheap to produce, no matter how much is open sourced, and a lot of it is, and we will open source everything that we use. It is really expensive to do a 13-country African story about something like that, let alone the production of it. So I would encourage you to look at that. I think areas where we need to be much more conscious is we did a recent series on the EPA, which I am absolutely certain should have been published in Spanish, possibly even before it was published in in English, but that would have been a much more effective way to. We did publish it with NBC Latino, and they were very terrific partners. But I think we need to think more about the sort of language groups, the cultural groups we're trying to reach.
Anybody else on that question, or we'll move on?
I'm Mike Snow. I'm an independent journalist. I've contributed articles from all various parts of the world. I'm concerned especially about the trend in journalism, failure to report real news stories and the preponderance of distraction stories. But I'm especially concerned about vehicles that we accept as the gold standard, such as public television, public radio, and their deference, increasing deference to big grantees as sort of a promotion vehicle for their hidden agendas. And that seems to be increasing, and I'm alarmed about it. And I'd like to get some comments about that from the representative of public broadcasting.
I will say that, certainly there's no desire on the part of anyone in public broadcasting that I'm aware of to advance the agendas, or hidden or otherwise, of those who support us in the work that we do. So can you be more specific?
Well, the Gates Foundation, for example, gives millions of dollars to public broadcasting, and they're heavily engaged in promoting genetically modified agriculture in Africa, for example. And there's distorted coverage or no coverage, and it's perceived by many people in many parts of Africa as a very bad thing. We perceive it here because of the media's coloration of it as a good thing. There's a huge disconnect there.
I certainly note your concern, but I will say that within PBS specifically, there's very, very careful scrutiny given to the underwriting policy for all of the shows. And we engage in an ongoing conversation about making sure that that any level of underwriting that comes in is targeted perhaps at broadcast, not targeted towards specific segments. There's a lot of nuance in that to make sure that, in fact, the concerns that you're bringing to the fore are not, that are not realized.
Yeah, I think independence and objectivity are difficult to achieve. However, I do think that credibility and transparency in this case would play a big role in any piece that is done like that, financed by Gates or whoever. It just needs to be prominently displayed that Gates was among the funders. So I think those are the two critical points.
Let me give you a further example. I make it a point to volunteer once or twice a year at my local public radio station, and I happened to be there in 2014 when Melinda Gates was a guest. And she was using these kind of code words like sacred seed and right seeds. And the host of the show gave her a complete pass, and she's asking her about how she met Bill and completely irrelevant questions to the subject at hand. And she's getting her message across, and then there's this complete distraction of her social relationship, how she met Bill, and she went on ad infinitum about that. And that, I went home and I listened to that interview afterward, and it was wrought with so many mistakes and so many errors and so much false information that was never questioned by the host, Diane Rehm.
I'd like to add just one comment. I don't know about bias in PBS or NPR, but I know that overall philanthropy gets a walk. And there's very little examination of what that sector does in fact support. And GMO is a great example. I mean, Monsanto is a US-based corporation, and Gates funded the development of the GMOs, also in cooperation with Monsanto, and there you go. So it's a dilemma, I think.
Any other comments from the panelists before we move on?
This was a huge topic of conversation a few years ago when we started funding journalism at the community level. And I'm not sure there's a solution to this because as we've funded it, obviously the Community Foundation, like any foundation, has some point of view. But we've said, we're funding reporters to report on health care, for instance, in our community. And other than that, we're out of it. Can we report on you? Yes, you can report on me. But it's all human beings. First of all, I'm not a very interesting story, and report on me, but I don't know whether those journalists didn't pursue a story for fear of aggravating us or not. But there's almost an unsolvable problem, and it's the same problem that existed when advertising subsidized journalism, right? So I take your point. I don't know what anybody would do about it. It'd be impossible for us to put money into journalism without, like, putting the money into journalism.
Could I add one thing to this? Because I think
Just sure, one.
it
yeah,
is
then
about
we'll go to
funding
another
too.
question.
Is that it is extremely difficult to get general support funding from most foundations, and that I think because of so much of it is project related, aggravates the perception of this problem. So I think that it would be excellent to have a bigger conversation with foundations about the need to support organisations overall as well as specific projects, and I know why they do, but it would that can help in removing such a fear of political or unclear influence.
So I want to move on to a question that has come in from Twitter. We have a couple of them. From Noah, he is asking really a question about who's reporting these stories. And a comment was made earlier. Peter, I believe you made this comment about really the expense, the incredible cost of investigative journalism. And so I think that this comes into play here as well. And so Noah wants to ask the panel a couple of things with relation to the journalists themselves who can participate in nonprofit media. And he first asks, how can citizen journalists participate in nonprofit news models? And then also, how can professionals and novices, or sort of maybe the unprofessional journalists work together to really bring the best stories to bear in the area of nonprofit media?
Would you like me to start on that? Since
I would love for you to
I
start.
imagine this is Noah Ehrenberg who's tweeting at CNCWPG. So I think the public are fantastic sources. I'm always stunned by how ready people are to talk to journalists when they turn up at their door. It's usually, particularly if they haven't got something to hide. So that is, a traditional form of journalism. I think Noah is absolutely right to bring up this idea of how we bring in the wider community into these, and I don't think we, as an organisation, do that in any way adequately yet. We have a new person leading social strategy who came from NPR, and I hope he manages to bring these voices in and much more effectively than they are now. I think there's also great possibilities for mass reporting, for collecting data from the mass audience, and not necessarily using professional journalists to do that. We also run two separate reporting models. The ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which is a bit of a mouthful, is our international arm, and it is the biggest collaborative journalism platform in the world. It did the HSBC Swiss leak story this year, which you might have seen, which it had huge impact in the UK, huge impact in India. It is working on similar stories now, which involve bringing together both freelance and professionally employed journalists and their media organizations to amplify the impact of that. That's a model I would like to bring to the United States, particularly to State House reporting, where I'd like to offer those same kind of collaborative tools, because I think in most state houses there is only one dominant, or many state houses, there's only one dominant paper, and also those state house reporters have been squeezed, and so giving them some collaborative tools would be extremely helpful.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel want to address that?
Well, I would second what Peter said, but it takes money to use citizen journalists, because as a professional journalist, you edit it according to AP style, right? First thing. You're worried about your facts, so you're going to double check. And the citizen journalists might not have as much time to double check the facts and meet all the editor's questions. So it all comes back, do we have the resources to really incorporate this? And you just mentioned you hired somebody to take the lead on this. More is better. More information is better.
I'd also take a look at a fantastic product called Storyful, which is a video product that News Corporation bought. It does fantastic verification of footage. For example, it really grew out of Syria, where you had lots of people, many of them combatants, many of them innocent people, putting up footage of extraordinary events. what Storyfield did was find a way to verify those using social media, using people on the ground. There's another one that we used at CNN a lot, which with the name of which has just immediately escaped me. But Twitter and individuals are always faster now than traditional media, almost always. And there is, so that's where the news is coming in. We've then got a news data miner was the company. I'm sorry that we used at CNN. There is always news out there that we're not picking up, and it is in the social sphere, and it is being witnessed by real people. So there are plenty of verification tools out there now.
Thank you, Maria. I know you want to comment.
No, I just wanted to, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but, back in 2010, Corporation for Public Broadcasting began funding a group of local journalism centers around the country. And the aim of this was to, number one, help develop and professionalize more newsrooms at the local level, and then to strengthen them by creating these cooperatives across stations around a range of issues. And then earlier this year, they've now expanded that and are now funding efforts for regional journalism centers that are focused more on regional issues. And again, I think there's a recognition that certainly it requires more than the startup capital of 2-year investment to get these things off the ground, to maintain them and to help them build. But the ambition is that these local centers will then be able to produce reports that are at the level that, number one, can feed their own local media sources, and then number two, feed into the national programs.
Thank you. I know we have a couple of questions from the floor here, so we'll take those, and then I have another from Twitter.
Thank you. My name is Susan Haig with Civic Story, a nonprofit news site based in New Jersey. And thank you to both panels for really fascinating insights. I thought I could just quickly share our recent process, especially to the first panel, of receiving tax-exempt status. We put in our 1023 form last January, and the attorney advising us said, okay, you won't hear anything for a few months, and then they'll call if your portfolio is complete or not, and then wait another 6 to 9 months, and hopefully you'll hear. And within 8 weeks, we were delighted to receive our letter of tax exemption. Now, we pride ourselves on saying that our application was so brilliant that it was just immediately accepted. It might have just, they might have just quickly looked at, mission statement check, whatever check, and put it in the pile. So I would love to know. So CELIA, if you have any insight in the background and can ever let us know, that would be great. But I do want to also say that our plan, the revenue structure that we see as most beneficial would be a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split for long-term sustainability, and that would be 1/3 earned revenue, 1/3 individual donations, small and large. We have donations from $20 to $15,000, so if that base is growing, that's a sustainability. And then finally 1/3 from foundations, and hopefully multiple foundations, because you don't want in journalism, one big foundation name. That's just a recipe for vulnerability or for influence. So I'd like to put out that suggestion that if there's a 1/3 threshold, that seems to me a good conversation to have among foundations, and it would mean different groups of foundations moving in and out for a few years. But it would also mean not taking ownership of it. So that would be a kind of interesting discussion.
Yeah, one thing, when I mention percentages from foundations, I'm also including family foundations and local foundations, community foundations. And I think those of us who work for the bigger national journalism funders groups need to advocate and work and show the importance and show the relevancy and show the benefits of getting more local people involved, because you can't count on Knight and Tom Glazer and McCormick and Ethics and Excellence forever. So our work really begins at the local level. Now, when community foundations do step into the fold, I have noticed, at least in Chicago, they sometimes will pull back because journalism is expensive, it's hard to measure. But more important, sometimes they don't have the same relationship, and they don't get along with journalists because they're not the type of people that they're usually serving or partnering with. And I think in many ways that's a good thing, but it's going to take education, it's going to take a lot of patience. But I think the local news organizations ultimately are going to have to tap in much more to local family and community foundations.
ahead.
Anyone else in the CELIA, any comment about their speedy approval?
I think my comment is that it's nice. You applied in January 2014 or 15?
15.
15. So 2015, things have speeded up dramatically in the IRS across the board. It's
Right.
almost like tax exemptions are on sale these days.
Okay.
And so they're moving very quickly. It would have been a different story if you'd applied in January of 2011. And I think some of that is a reflection on some of the good work that's been done, by the council and others.
Sue, if I can just pose a quick question.
Absolutely.
My question is regarding what I see as a huge opportunity for nonprofit news. Peter, we wanted to make sure you knew there was an election coming up, but we also want to make sure as a newcomer you know that there's a climate crisis and a pope coming, and the need for our entire world to, in a way, restructure. And to me, that's just a beautiful opportunity for nonprofit news, because you want to empower citizens. You need information. Citizens need to know what they need to do differently. And there seems to be a bit of a news bubble. There's good coverage, there's good individual articles, but if you look at day-to-day news, we wouldn't know that we are on the cusp of a huge shift of the way we use energy and operate. So I think, Tom, as a philosopher, I wondered if you see this too as just an opportunity and a need for nonprofit news that helps us make this shift.
Calling me a philosopher might be overstating it, but
It's in your resume.
but no, I think there is a great opportunity in this. The news and the news institutions are going through this shift with the public, and I just want to just tie your business model one third with the questions around engagement, and really a lot of that money that's going to come in small dollars is going to come from people who might have just tweeted something or have read something and then stepping up and really following that engagement. I think is something, both in terms of the stories that you wish to tell, and using that as a feedback loop into your institution, I think is hugely powerful. And the title like Civic Story, I suspect you already do. But I just wanted to underline that because there's something around this positive feedback loop that I think has a lot of promise.
May I add something? I think it was 1987 that the FCC changed the rules on objectivity on television. And from an external point of view, it'd be very interesting to reflect on whether that's produced any benefits or the benefits that were perceived at that time. Because that echo chamber that you think you're in. I mean, there is fantastic work being done by US publishers and others on climate change. And then there's fantastic work being done by the deniers of climate change to counter what is, by other people accepted science, including, the United Nations scientist group on climate change. There's only so much that you can do to push against ignorance. And then if people will find their own desirable echo chambers, particularly people of our age group, and I think young people less so.
Thank you. I want to move to one more question from the floor, then I have a Twitter question, and then we'll be just about wrapping.
Sure. Craig Aaron from Free Press. We're advocates on media and technology issues, though my question is not actually about advocacy. It's about metrics and eyeballs, and I'm curious to know more from the panel. Talk to a lot of journalists working in legacy newsrooms who are increasingly being fed a lot of numbers and information about how their stories are doing, and in fact, very often their pay is tied, or their bonuses are tied to the ability for their stories to get a lot of views, a lot of comments, a lot of traffic in social media. So I'm curious to hear a little bit of the thoughts from the panel on pluses and minuses there. We're certainly not better off without the information about the stories they're getting out there, but there are incentives that are created there that may not be producing the most in-depth or best journalism. And really, there's a lot of incentives to just constantly update. My dreaded two-part question is, I'm also interested in the other side, which is if we want to increase the quality of local news, if we want to support these emerging local outlets, they themselves have a bit of an eyeball problem. Even if they produce really good work, they can't maintain the audience. So places like BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or others have solved that problem by surrounding the journalism with a lot of celebrity content and constant feeding. That's a lot harder to do at the local level. It's extremely hard for startups to do. Where do you see some possibilities for collaboration? And essentially, the two-part question boils down to how do we actually make good use of these metrics?
I'm incredibly tired of hearing journalists complaining about having metrics. because it's been going on for 10 or 15 years in my career here, and it's ridiculous. And it's time they stopped complaining, because they're finally getting to understand that they might have a connection to their audience. They've got an incredibly intimate connection if they want it, through the comments, through Twitter, through Facebook. They're finally being pulled face to face with their readers, and the reasons that the readers don't often read them, don't always read them. And you know, it is an institutional problem in the journalism industry, that in the past we've been able to operate in blissful ignorance of the people who were theoretically reading the stuff at the other end of it. And I'm kind of bored with it, really. But no, I'm not bored with it. It is incredibly important. The incentivizing people on page views is always a tricky thing. But what it is a transitional phase when you're trying to get the journalists it's a rather crude way of getting the journalists to give a damn about the reader, which to a huge extent they never have. So that's a crude mechanism, but it's the best, one of the better ones that mainstream media have now.
Do we see a better mechanism, I guess is what my question
I'm sorry,
boils
do we
down
what?
to. Is there a better mechanism than that sort of?
I think time online is a much better mechanism for most people, and those ones will come through. Journalists that, we found at CNN in particular, journalists where they take the time to go in and curate their own comments at the bottom of their stories have a huge response to that. It takes time, it takes a true connection, and most journalists historically have had a fire and forget. I've written this. It is out there on plates. Please read it. On stone, etched on stone, and that is a constant battle. And I think we've got to make our content relevant, readable, desirable, compelling in whatever form it reaches people. And it's not the death of long form. You look at the New York. I don't think the New Yorker has ever been healthier. The Economist is incredibly strong. Medium, funded by Evan Williams, is a fabulous outlet for the longer form journalism. So it's not a sort of long form versus short form versus listicles. But I think it's time journalists got with the program on being connected to their audience.
I have some thoughts on this issue. Yeah, you got to look at your Google Analytics, and puzzle through what they mean. It's very difficult to understand what they mean. That said, but you have to look at them. But I never knew who our audience was, because all we have is raw numbers. And I believe that, first of all, Women's E-News will probably never, win the numbers game, right? I mean, if you compare us to Huffington Post or even ProPublica. So how do we communicate our strength? And we figured out a way to identify 500 subscribers from their email signature. And we found, and it's biased, and we're going to continue to do this, that 23% of our readers were connected to universities, either faculty or administration, and what percent were activists, and what percent were in direct service. That gave us a much better sense of who we are already reaching, and who we might want to continue or reach out to or whatever. And that's what analytics won't tell you. And when we went through this whole process recently over the past year of trying to renovate and do all sorts of things, and when I asked the consultants, yes, but who is our audience? They're like, what? Well, if you look at your Google Analytics, I'm like, no. I want to know who we're reaching. So to me, that's the big challenge.
Yeah, let me take it from the funder's perspective. It's not like we're omnipotent and we're collecting all this data just for the sake of collecting data, though it may seem that way. I think we're also accountable to our bosses and our board, who sometimes don't have a good fix on what is relevant and what is valuable. And I think if you ask Sue and other people at the Council on Foundations, that much of the programming in the last few years has addressed just this topic. So it is very much a work in progress. We're all looking for those, those magic numbers, those magic ways of measuring impact and the accountability and the evaluation. But it's something that even at the foundation level is a major topic of debate.
If I could just add, from the programming standpoint, it's been incredibly important for us for finding and cultivating new audience. Like, for example, PBS has been working on its independent film series and trying to create broader audiences, newer audiences for those films. You have an anthology series where from one week to the next, the topics can swing and vary greatly, but you know that each one of those documentaries deserves the best audience possible. And so using things like paid social media to be able to micro-target and reach out and find people who are going to have an interest in those films has been, critical to us in figuring out the next phase of our strategy around that. So I think you're absolutely right to be concerned about the idea of creating journalism-based incentives. But on the other side of this, we've absolutely got to know who we're reaching and how to get to them.
Thank you. Okay, we have 2 questions from Twitter. We have very few minutes left, so we're going to call this the lightning round. Quick answers. The first question from Judith, coming to us from Twitter, really gets back to some of the early comments that we heard in these presentations around kind of the marriage or the cohabitation, if you will, of the for-profit and the nonprofit spheres, or at least the nonprofit sector. And she asks what our panelists think about for-profit news entities running content that is funded by reporting fellows or reporters who from the nonprofit sphere. So quickly, just this intersection of the 2 worlds. Thoughts on that?
I hope the for-profit media also paid them.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important part of our strategy.
We funded reporting that was transmitted through for-profit media outlets.
Pretty much all of our shows are in some form of partnership with a for-profit partner.
I would echo that and say that I think partnerships are not only of the future, they're clearly of the present. And I think the question facing the non-profit space is how to make that a fair deal.
Yeah.
Which is obviously working on that.
And I'm watching what the IRS and Council on Foundations is going to say about that ultimately.
Celia, that may be the next question we have to explore, right? So for the final question, again, lightning round style, from J. Robert Schul, also joining us on Twitter, and I think he might be here too. As online services like Netflix replace cable and broadcast news, how can nonprofit media engage in these new options?
I think that was sort of the idea of Al Gore with current TV to some extent, which of course is now Al Jazeera Americas. It would require us all to cooperate a little bit more than we do. The Reveal News project by CIR in California is not a bad example of this, where I think the Center for Public Integrity has produced, I think, 8 of the first stories of theirs. It's produced a very, very high quality podcast and radio quality material on PRX. It's a very good curated sort of amalgam of the best of investigative journalism out there at the moment. And that's the way that we've chosen to go into radio and podcasting, is with a competitor organization, if you like.
We've used our own people, and but again, it's not that high quality, but because of the uniqueness of our content, we think there's a market. We'd love to do more.
We are constantly challenging our grantees to think about being platform agnostic, because the platforms go away and new ones appear faster than any of us can imagine today.
I mentioned it before, Frontline is premiering on Roku as opposed to on PBS. We are aggressively working with all of the over-the-top platforms to make sure that our content can find viewers wherever they want and need to find it.
Just add that, I mean, no one knows where this is going to end with the over-the-top providers. Apple, Verizon, I think yesterday or the day before, coming out with something. Comcast as well. For me, the only answer here is lean in and experiment, because it's completely uncertain, I think, to even those who put multiple tens of millions of dollars into this, as to where it will end up.
Is it news when it's made and happening, or is it news when the consumer sees it? And I think that many of the smaller nonprofit and local organizations need to start realizing the value of their archives, their footage, and what's in their libraries.
Thank you. I think this panel has been fabulous. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Very open, honest, intriguing, provocative conversation. So thanks to all of you for participating today. Thank you to our virtual audience that's been very vibrant and active, all of you for sticking in for this conversation.
What are the metrics of our virtual audience?
Well, you know what? We're going to have to find that out and let you know. This conversation can certainly continue. The Council on Foundations is very engaged and committed in issues around this. I see my friends from independent sector here as well. I know that this is an interesting issue across our memberships, so we always invite comment and more. I would be remiss again if I did not thank the Knight Foundation, particularly Eric Newton, Andrew Sherry, and Jennifer Preston for their continued support of the Council on Foundations and this work. Obviously to our panelists, to Celia and her colleague Kim Eny for drafting this new report that we all see. On behalf of the Council on Foundations and Vicki Spruill, thank you so much for joining us here today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.